Later this hour, travel expert Liz Beatty will. I've turned her on to a television show, and she said, "All right, I'm going to watch it and let's talk about it. This sounds good." And I don't know if she's seen it. I haven't talked to her since. So she's going to join us later this hour, and we'll see if she's seen it. Are families doing enough to talk about a normalized planning for the aging and end-of-life process? Mallory McGrath is the founder and CEO of Vive Planning and joins us on Canada Now. Mallory, good to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, it's a bit more about what your company does.
Sure. We focus on helping clients and their families to plan for the aging and end-of-life process. So we look at this process, which is traditionally known as estate planning, from a much more holistic perspective, and that we want to involve not only, say, the client, their spouse, but also their children, their extended family, and really help to create a continuity and an understanding of the way that a person will progress through their aging process and their eventual end of life.
Yeah, I mean, conflict at the end or at the time of a family member's death can be, I would think, often avoided. Like if there is communication while everyone is living, and there you are stepping in with that.
Exactly. I used to be a litigation law clerk, and we dealt a lot with estate litigation. And by the time families got to us, they were destroyed. There's only so much you can do, Jeff, by the time a sibling sues a sibling, right? There's only so much you can actually do to step in and help them. And I began to realize that a lot of it stemmed from the parents who at that point had died, who just didn't communicate what their wishes were, didn't explain the choices in their last will and testament, or explain why one child might have been on a bank account and another one wasn't, right? Was that done because they intended to gift the money to that child, or was it done just for tax probate reasons? There's so many things that we're just not talking about with our adult children. And so then that leaves it up to their imagination to wonder, what are they going to inherit? Why did dad pick this sibling over the other? There's so many things that we can be really helping our families to understand by just having simple conversations about it.
Oh, for sure. And you talk about estate litigation. There's only so much money one has. I mean, I would think that these conflicts can also be very, very costly.
Incredibly costly. I worked for an estate litigator, and it was astonishing how much money these estates were spending. Because keep in mind, it's not just, one side spending the money, it's both sides. And the estate is being drained of these assets that could be going to this family for them to then change their own lives, change their next generation lives. Like, this is what legacy giving should be. It should be giving what you have earned in your life to your next generation or to your loved ones and seeing that pass on. But instead, we're seeing estate litigators, lovely people as they are, make really high incomes off of family squabbles that could have been resolved if things were communicated prior to a loved one's death.
Yeah, and death brings out so many emotions when it happens to a loved one. Like you can't properly make a decision when in that state. So it would be in one's best interest to really prepare oneself well down the line before you're put into that situation.
Exactly. I always say that grief and greed are a destructive cocktail of emotions. And I always like to say to parents who have adult children, you have no idea what's going to happen in your child's life that's going to change them in the next 10, 20, 30 years. You can't just say that because your family is all happy now, that they'll be happy later. When we have families who have adult children who say aren't married yet or don't have children of their own, those are really huge milestones that your adult children haven't reached yet. They don't have a spouse that influences and, impacts decisions and opinions they might have. They don't know what it's like to have children of their own or own property of their own. How can you possibly know the human being that they're going to become in a decade or more? And so it's really key that these conversations happen now, but then continually happen as every member of the family goes through their own paths in life that really define who they are.
And I would think that as kids become adults and as they get older, there might be parents that just assume that, say their firstborn is going to be the one that's going to carry the load of decision making. But then having a conversation and having proper communication might afford that oldest to say, look, I don't want to be the one to do all that. There might be someone that says, I don't want the kind of responsibility that you're bestowing onto me.
Exactly. You know, I always say to people who pick either, say, their firstborn son or their firstborn child, and I said, well, are you only picking them because they're your firstborn son or your firstborn child? Because that's not a reason, right? Who is this person that you're picking? If your firstborn son happens to be an accountant and you pick them for your power of attorney of property, okay, well, that makes some sense, right? They know how to manage money and to deal with taxes. That's great. But if you're just picking them because of a role that they have in the family, that's not a good enough reason. There should always be a why behind every decision. And I always say to clients, if you can't share the why with me, then you can guarantee that the people who love and care about you and have expectations of you, your family, that they are going to be left with a lot of confusion if they are not told what the why is behind the choices you've made.
You know, Mallory, isn't it amazing that death is still considered such a sad thing to talk about, and that it is still so taboo? I mean, newsflash, we're all going to die. Like that's going to happen. You know, so we have to be best prepared for when this is going to happen.
Exactly, Jeff. One of the things that I like to open a lot of my talks with is a slide that says 100% of us are going to die. And I just leave that sitting there for a couple seconds and let it really ruminate in the room because, I mean, even myself, I spend all day talking about aging and end of life and post-death. But if you ask me to think about my death, I get just as uncomfortable as the next person. I think it's just in our human nature, right, to survive at all costs. And true, I'm 35. If I were to die now, leaving behind a young child, that would be tragic. But when I die when I'm 95, that's not tragic. That is the end of a really well-lived life. And even though it will bring sadness, we should still also be celebrating this exceptional life that the person who died had. And if we can start talking about the end of life in a more liberated fashion, I think we will see that a lot more families progress through life just with a lot more understanding of each other and the journeys they have ahead of them.
Last hour we had our futurist Nick Babington on, and we were talking about aging and the aging process, and you know, the science behind it, and hopefully the work that's being done will be able to live longer, and some of the consequences that come with that. But it's not a conversation of we're going to live forever. It's about extending life. So, what tips might you have for families to get a conversation started? Because I think once the conversation gets up and going, you kind of get in the bath a little bit, you get in the pool and you acclimatize yourself to the temperature, and you go, all right, I could stay in here for a while. I think families and family members just might need a bit of a nudge.
Yeah, that was a great analogy. I might have to steal that one, Jeff, and use it sometime. That was good. What I like to say is before you can have a conversation with anyone, you have to have it with yourself. And if you can't sit on your own, open a bottle of wine, pour a beer, whatever you have to do to get through it, but if you can't sit there and think about getting old and think about dying, if you can't do that with yourself for like 5 minutes, then how are you ever going to talk to someone else, especially your children, who we are just, destined to protect at all costs, right? You need to start by talking to yourself. And then if you have a spouse, having that conversation with them. And then you figure out how to communicate best with your children, because all of your children are probably going to be different, right? There might be some that can handle sitting down in person, some that need to do it over the phone, some that need to do it by letter or email. Everyone is different in their communication style, and that's really key. It used to be that I really advocated for in-person communication no matter what, but COVID really changed that for me as well, where I realized that's not always an option. So we have to be open to different forms of communication. And at the end of the day, however is best to communicate your wishes to start that conversation, that's what's going to be best for your family. And I've definitely found with the families I've worked with that, that first time it's uncomfortable and you got to just rip the Band-Aid off and make some jokes and pop some popcorn and do what you have to do to just keep it natural, right? As natural as possible. But then I found that families find it easier to bring it up. It doesn't have to be a whole big monumental event. It can be very casual after that because you've ripped the Band-Aid off, you've broken down that wall, and you're able to just talk about something that is completely normal and natural, which is the end of your life.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I went through a difficult time last year, Mallory. My father passed away. He had Alzheimer's. So
I'm sorry.
With that, Yeah, thanks. With that kind of an illness, though, it does prepare you. Like I talk about it. It's like ripping a Band-Aid slowly off. Like you're
Yeah.
preparing for the inevitable because you don't recover, you don't get better, you just slowly get worse if you're stricken with that illness. So we had lots of time to plan, which we did. We spent that time wisely. And again, like with that illness is in fact actually a lesson here that can be applied in that being proactive instead of being reactive. That was a lesson in that illness, to always be ahead of it so that you're not like a turtle on your back trying to figure out what's best for your loved one. So in making those preparations, we had time. But then when my dad did pass away and we did have to go into the funeral home, and that day and the day after and make all of those arrangements, I did say to my mom, I said, look, I hate to tell you this, but we're going to have to do this for you someday. And it might be of a financial benefit to get this all done for you right now, in that the funeral home would give us a deal on this and a deal on that, because, you're buying not like a 2-for-1 deal, but you know what I mean? And,
Yes, I do. Yeah.
and also, like, I am with you here at the funeral home. Like, this might be an opportunity for you to give me some insight as to what you want so we can make these plans right now. She paid for everything, so it's all paid for. It's all done. It's uncomfortable to do, and that was a horrible time to have to do it, but I'm glad we did it. I have everything ready to go should my mom pass away. Hopefully that's going to be like decades from now, but let's be real, it's going to happen. So you got to have those conversations.
100%. And a lot of times parents say, I don't want to burden my children. And I always say, like, if we use your example, right? Say that no planning had been done. Say your father refused to speak about it. Say your mother then after he died refused to. I mean, really the burden isn't having the conversation, isn't organizing things up front. The burden is losing your father or losing your mother, being stricken with grief and having to figure it all out. Right? The burden is someone being diagnosed with Alzheimer's and it's fast progressing and there's no time to figure things out, because then you have to go through the court system as opposed to having a power of attorney, right? That the person with Alzheimer's would have signed. There's so many things that can be done that really are a lot easier to handle when you're able to do it, as opposed to adding grief, greed, jealousy, resentment, confusion, all these emotions on top of having to handle an estate, to administer it, to figure out whether or not your mom or dad wants to be taken off life support. There's so many emotional things and choices that will have to be made. But if they're made before, it's a lot less daunting at the time. It's easy to just say, this is what mom wants, this is what dad wants, and move forward and actually focus on what you should be focusing on, which is grieving.
Yeah, right, exactly. And, in talking about death and planning for the inevitable, obviously the inevitable is aging and the aging process. And it is also a good conversation, I think, and I say kids, but I mean like, they could be in their 30s, for kids to know exactly what their parents want to do with the rest of their life. In talking about, maybe doing some traveling, in talking about living in a retirement facility. I mean, those things can be expensive, especially living in a facility like that. I can't tell you, like, now I'm in my mid 40s. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people pass away or people get sick, and they have to quickly move into a facility, and the due diligence hasn't been done as far as where they should go, how they would go about paying for that. And then again, turtle on your back, you're trying to figure all of these things out in a very short amount of time. You should want to know, or you should know from your parents, well, what do they want to do? What are the last years of their life going to look like if they had it their way?
Yeah, I like to say that I think we are coming into an aging pandemic. We have this generation, the baby boomers, the largest generation we've seen in our lifetime and their lifetime, and they are all super healthy and doing great right now, but the next 10 to 20 years are going to be very telling. It's going to exhaust families, their dynamics within them. It's going to exhaust the government-based systems we have in place. And what's interesting is that 100% of people who are asked, whether or not they'd like to move to a retirement home or a long-term care home or age in place, which is aging in their home, 100% of them say they want to age in place. But what people don't realize is to be able to do that in an average middle-class two-story home, it involves renovating the home, moving a bedroom to the main level, or installing one of those chairs that takes you up the stairs. It involves bringing in PSWs, which are incredibly costly. It involves navigating the LIN network, which helps you to get the supports you need. It is an exhaustive process to age in your home. So then if you do decide, okay, it'll just be easier to move to a retirement home or assisted living facility or something like that, well, then all of a sudden you're hit with this cost that you were not expecting. And so when I'm talking to, as you said, kids, which, in the mid-30s like me, when I'm talking to my friends and colleagues about things, I say, you need to start planning to be older now, because we have no idea what the baby boomer generation will do to the systems we have in place now, because they are going to live much longer lives than we anticipated. And so we need to start saving to live to be 100, because that isn't an unrealistic number. As we see right now, the silent generation, so these are my grandparents, they're living to on average 86 for men and 89 for women. And that's just the average, which means we have people into their 90s who are living and are still well enough to live, but then also need a lot of support, whether that be because they have conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's, or because they have physical issues that they have to deal with. And I'm always reminded of the statistic, which blows my mind, that 3 out of 4 Canadians over the age of 65 have at least one chronic disease. And that's just the average again. There are definitely more, I think, than just one chronic disease with a lot of people in that last third of their life. And to be able to support that just from a financial and economical perspective is really overwhelming. So the younger generations, the Gen X like you and the millennials like me, we need to be thinking about not just our parents and how to help them, but how to prepare for our own aging process now.
Yeah. And, you talk about support, financial and otherwise. Part of that is who's going to be the team that takes care of that person. One thing that I wouldn't say we were blindsided by it, but when my dad got sick, it was all of a sudden my mother has got to be a primary caregiver. Well, then what are the roles going to be for everybody else? And we quickly learned that some were going to offer more than others in terms of support. And as one gets more sick, the team that is built around that person to support not only the person that's ill, but the primary caregiver, that team has to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that could be part of the conversation as well, to really flush out what that team is going to look like.
Exactly. I'm always asking my clients what their current health situation is, also what their family health situation is, similar to how a doctor asks. But I'm asking from the perspective of what might we be looking down the tunnel at here, right? Someone says there's a family history of Alzheimer's or dementia. Well, then we need to talk about that possibility, right? If there's a lot of cancer in a family history, we need to talk about that. It's really important to recognize, that 1 in every 4 Canadians is a caregiver right now. That's a pretty overwhelming number. And that's not just necessarily for elderly people. That could be for anyone who needs care at whatever stage of life they're in. But, spending an average of 19 hours per week acting as a caregiver, which I think is a pretty low number. I know a lot of caregivers that they're working full time and spending upwards of an additional 20 to 30 hours helping the person that needs assistance. And that is going to deplete a person, their finances, a family unit. I mean, power to your family that made it through what was, I'm sure, a really, difficult and challenging journey at times with your father, right? Helping him through that part of his life. But it can tear families apart acting as caregivers as well, because as you said, unless you've sat down and really thought about here's my strength, here's my sister's strength, my brother's strength, here's what mom can do, here are what we are all good at. So let's figure out how to be the best team we can to support this loved one through this difficult time in their life. And a lot of families just don't sit down and have that very frank conversation, because for the individuals in that family, it means admitting what their weaknesses are, whether it be emotional weaknesses, like I can't watch dad go through this, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to say, right? Or knowing what their time commitment weaknesses are. Some people have more demanding jobs than others. Some people don't live nearby, right? Like, it's about figuring out what someone can contribute and then not playing the plus minus game. Who's giving more? Who's giving less? It's who can give what. Great. Now let's move forward and make this as seamless as possible. And if you don't have those conversations, that's where that resentment is going to settle in a family.
Absolutely. And I can honestly say that does happen from personal experience. You figure out who's going to be doing what ahead of time. Absolutely. Check out viveplanning.ca. Again, Vive is spelled Vive planning.ca. Founder and CEO Mallory McGrath. Mallory, a very good conversation. Really appreciate your having it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This was great. Have a wonderful day.
All right. You too. Thank you. Again, viveplanning.ca.